All right, here we are. It's Thursday. It's time for Bible study. It has been a couple of weeks since we've been together. So far in our study of the life of Christ, we've made it all the way up to his birth and his presentation in the temple when he was just a wee bairn, a few days old. With Simeon and Anna. We've talked about Herod. We've talked about genealogy. We've talked about the whole promise of the Messiah going back all the way to Genesis 3 and up to the time of Jesus. And so I believe we're actually really kind of ready to get into some more Jesus stuff. So we're going to be in the book of Luke today in chapter 2. But that's probably the only New Testament place we'll be today, Luke chapter 2, because we want to look at Jesus' childhood. There's a big jump from Jesus is born and 8 days old in the temple to he begins his ministry after his baptism. That's a span of what most people believe is probably about 30 years. And the entirety of what we know about Jesus' childhood, between his infancy and the beginning of his adult ministry, all of it takes place in Luke chapter 2, verses 40 through 50. Verse 40 is really kind of the end of the last bit, but it seems important to tag it here. The child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Verse 41, every year Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends, and when they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. As a parent of at least one 12-year-old boy so far, and another one who's, as they say, pert near, this story hits me a little differently as a parent than it did before I was married and had kids. But I guess we'll get there in just a minute. I think it's interesting that both verse 40 and verse 52, the beginning of this bit and the end of this bit, talk about the same sort of progress. Verse 40 says, the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom and the grace of God was on him. The end of it, verse 52, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. I think there's some commonalities there between those two verses, which I think we should talk about. I think that seems to be the point that Luke is making here, is that this little sweet baby boy, King Jesus, didn't stay that way, that he really did grow up to be a man in all the ways that we would expect. Obviously, Jesus grew in physical size. The child grew and became strong. He grew in physical size and strength. That's what boys do. But Luke also talks about some other development. He didn't just grow up as a little boy would do through toddlerhood and all that stuff. But Luke also focuses on his other development. It says, Luke says that he grew in wisdom, and in both passages, 40 and 52. And so we should talk just a minute about what that wisdom is. Okay, so when Luke says that he grew in wisdom, or he was filled with wisdom, that would include really kind of all of the knowledge that a boy needs to become a man, but not just how to change your spark plugs and how to cook on a fire and all the things that we want to teach our kids to. Not just sort of those sorts of things. He grew in that sort of knowledge, but also grew with divine knowledge. The idea that Luke, the picture that he paints here, is that boy Jesus is this little sponge who is just soaking up through his experiences, through his observations, through his study, because he would have gone to synagogue school like everybody else. That he's taking in all the wisdom that he needs. We think about, when we look at the Bible and think about men who were wise, obviously we have to sort of start with Solomon, who was supposed to have been the wisest of all men. He collected hundreds, thousands of proverbs in the book of Proverbs that are all collected wisdom, not just things that Solomon came up with on his own, but also things that had been passed around and taught and collected and assembled in that one place. And Jesus's wisdom would have far surpassed Solomon. I mean, it would have to. If Jesus is God, and God gave Solomon wisdom, God is not going to give Solomon more wisdom than he himself has. Obviously, it's a download. It's less than he has, but it is a lot more than anybody else got. But Jesus' wisdom would have been more than that. We do find in certain places in the Gospels that Jesus either directly refers to or sort of alludes to some of those proverbs of Solomon. Especially look in the Sermon on the Mount, we see that he talks about the same kinds of things that Solomon did. But in Matthew 12:42 and Luke 11:31, it's the same account, just different Gospels. It records there that Jesus is talking about the wisdom of Solomon, and how people like the Queen of the South came from very far away to get Solomon's wisdom. And then he says, now something greater than Solomon is here. That sounds to me like Jesus is claiming to be more wise than Solomon. Certainly more important than Solomon. What we see about Jesus as a child is that he was growing in wisdom. He was a wise son, and that later on he would become a wise teacher. Okay, he filled his soul with wisdom. Any questions or comments about that?
You keep breaking up.
I'm sorry, I'm not moving.
You know, I know. And you keep breaking up or just stopping for a second or two. It's okay, keep going. I just wanted you to know that.
Okay.
I would have thought he already knew everything there was to know.
Well, there'd be some people who would probably agree with that. That from the moment that he took on human form, that the full knowledge and wisdom of God was in him.
But it says he was asking questions. He wouldn't have to ask questions.
Right. I think maybe that's one of the points that Luke is making, is that he was a boy and he was growing like we would expect other boys to do. He was God in the flesh, but he was also fully human and developed in the same ways that everybody else would.
One of the things that some people do when they ask questions is they ask questions more to guide people to get their own answer, to get a specific answer.
Fishing.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that is possible, that Jesus may have done some fishing or asking questions for which he already knew the answers. But I think that verse 40 and 52 seem to make it a little more clear that Jesus really continued to develop and grow. Maybe it's only in the demonstration of the wisdom and the expression of it. I mean, he had all of it in there, and he just let more of it out, as you would expect a kid growing into a teenager, into a young man, into an adult would. But we see that he is a student, both a student of teachers, but also a sort of a student of human nature, taking in everything that he sees and gaining wisdom.
So he had divine knowledge and experience, but he didn't have any human knowledge and experience. I mean, he was born a baby, and I assume because he lowered himself to become fully human. Well, fully human is
Uneducated?
It's a blank slate, but
Well, he would have had a human brain, and some of those connections aren't done until you're 25 or 26.
The human knowledge, the human condition, growing up in an environment he hadn't been in, even though he created it. He was born an infant, just, what do we know?
Like all the rest of us, huh?
Yeah.
When Cody was talking, it made me kind of think of sort of a parallel thing. I suppose it's probably true for lots of people. I guess I fully realized it in my own experience. When I got out of high school, I went to college, went to Bible college, learned as much stuff as they could cram in my head about the Bible and about Jesus and about holiness and all that kind of stuff. And you think when you leave there with your degree, hey, I got it all. I have all this information, I have all this wisdom that's been downloaded into my brain, and now I'm going to go out into the real world as a 22-year-old, and I know what's what. And then you get into a church and you realize, I don't know anything. I have all this knowledge, I have all this information, but I don't have any practical world experience. And maybe that's a sort of like what Jesus is experiencing here. He has all of the wisdom and the knowledge of God, but fleshing that out amongst
Real people.
the real world is sometimes it's a bit of a disappointment as well. Because you think, oh, the church is going to be great, and then you get into the church and realize, wow, it's full of people who are really jacked up and crazy and selfish and small and
Normal.
wounded and all the things that people are.
It's full of people.
Yeah.
Period.
Exactly. Okay, so Jesus grew in wisdom. He filled himself with wisdom, but Luke also points twice to the grace of God that was on him. That word is charis, charis. It's kind of a big important word in Scripture. It has sort of a broad array of meanings. In the Old Testament, it's usually translated loving kindness. Sometimes it's kind of talked about as being God's covenant love. Sometimes it's translated favor. It's almost always translated grace in the New Testament. Again, there's a lot of color in this word, but we might just read this and think, well, the grace of God is on Jesus, that God is sort of sprinkled this blessing on the top of him as a gift. And that would be true, but that's not really the fullness of what's going on there. Because this grace isn't just as a gift. It includes God's graciousness, both in a person's manner, their behavior, their deeds. So all of God's grace on Jesus, what Luke tells us, was made evident to the people who were around him. It kind of worked its way out in real life. People could see the grace and the favor and the loving kindness and the graciousness of God in the way that Jesus interacted with people, even as a child and a tween and a teenager and a young adult. That all through his development, that God's graciousness, God's influence in his heart is working its way out and is reflected in his life. Certainly, by the time we see Jesus as an adult, as he is dealing with broken, sick, injured, chaotic, depressed, anxious, angry, rebellious people, we really do see God's grace and favor working its way out of him as he engages with them. Really, the only people that he really comes down hard on are the self-important, self-righteous, self-absorbed, self-promoting. He's very quick to oppose the proud and give grace to the humble. Okay? I guess sort of the summary of that big long paragraph is that God's grace fell down on Jesus, but it stayed there and it took root and it worked its way out in all of his interactions with everybody else. I don't know about you, but it seems like maybe that's something that we ought to try to adopt as well, a way to emulate Jesus. That as we ask God for grace and favor and blessing, as we seek his goodness and his loving kindness, that it ought not just be about sprinkle this fairy dust on me, God, because I really need some. It's supposed to be working its way, taking root in us and working its way into every cell, out into our conversations and our actions and our behavior and our attitude with everybody that we come in contact with. Would it be awesome if when people met us, they said, wow, I really see the goodness of God in you?
How do you spell that word? C-H.
Y-O-U.
Charis.
Is that where charisma came from?
It's the same root, yeah. Charisma, charismatic, charity. Okay, anything to say about grace, favor, loving kindness? Jesus had some when he started, but he increased in it more and more. It developed. He grew in that favor. At the end of the passage, down in verse 52, Luke says that Jesus didn't just have a big download of it at the beginning, but that he continued to advance. He kept increasing. The word has to do with the blacksmith shop. So you would take a piece of metal that's this long, and you would bang on it and bang on it and bang on it and bang on it and bang on it until it was a bigger piece, a longer piece. It covered, it goes from this block to the shape that you desire it to be. That's the verb for what Jesus was doing, that he was expanding and increasing in wisdom and grace that we've already talked about with God. But it also says that he increased in two other things: in stature, which I have always just assumed had to do with like his standing in the community, his social interactions. Oh man, that young Jesus boy, he's grown up to be a fine man. Everybody loves him. He's so good. He's so gracious. He's so this, whatever. That everybody looks at him and says, "Man, I just wish my kids would grow up to be just like Jesus." And they may have, but that's really not what Luke records. The same word is used by Luke in chapter 19 to talk about somebody else. It says that when Jesus was in Jericho, as he was going through the city, that there was a man there who was a tax collector who wanted to see Jesus, but because of his short stature, he couldn't see over the crowds. That is not a comment on Zacchaeus' social standing, although it would have been small as well. Everybody hated him. But it really is a reference to his physical size. When it says that Jesus increased in stature, it really is a long way of saying he got taller. The definition from the dictionary there for that word is that he's growing into a full adulthood, into height and comeliness of stature. I don't know what really comeliness is. I think it's attractiveness. He's grown up into a full-sized man. Maybe he was kind of tall. I don't know. Definitely taller than Zacchaeus. But he's growing physically. He's growing intellectually. He's growing in grace with God. But it also says that he grew in grace and favor with men as well. God's goodness was seen in him. And I think at least for a period in Jesus' life, people said, wow, that Jesus, he really is a fine young man. Gracious, kind, compassionate, helpful. He listens to his mother. He helps his father. I believe that at least for a period of his life, people looked at him and saw sort of a model child, a golden boy. I would use the phrase all-American. I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with this kid, which might be one of the things that would have made his ministry even more difficult. Because at one point you've grown in favor with God and with all your neighbors. Everybody who sees you loves you, and now all of a sudden you're teaching. People are like, "Whoa, where are you coming from, Jack? Why don't you just sit down and be quiet?" There's rejection of him by many. So I believe that there is some application for us here. There's always application. Jesus, even though he was fully divine, was also fully human, and he grew in wisdom. He grew in grace with God. He grew physically. He grew socially in relationships with others. I don't think we should ever believe that we're done growing, especially when it comes to wisdom and God's grace. We want those things to work their way into us and out of us. It doesn't come as a download in the middle of the night. It's something we have to work on. It is something that becomes a part of us once we're baptized and we have God's Holy Spirit in us, and we allow the fruit of the Spirit to begin changing us and bearing fruit. Questions or comments?
As a golden child, what do you think his siblings thought of him?
Well, they may have really liked him too. I mean,
Or they might have thrown him in a pit like
How
Joseph.
about example?
They probably adored him, I would imagine. He was probably so sweet to them.
They couldn't help it.
I know.
But fully human, was he precocious too? I mean, was he?
I'm
he
gonna
had great power.
I'm going to assume that when Jesus was a 10-year-old boy, that he acted a lot like a 10-year-old boy.
Well, he was, yeah.
Maybe not in every regard, but I'm assuming he was probably just as rammy and active and curious and everything else. It is not outside of my vision of Jesus to imagine him wrestling with his brothers or his cousins or the kids in the neighborhood and chucking rocks in the pond, and I don't think he would have done anything rebellious against God. And what we do see here in just a few verses is that he was obedient to his parents. He was submissive to them. He followed their direction. As I was contemplating this week this piece of Jesus' life, I had a thought that I hadn't had before. Like, I wonder if Jesus had a bar mitzvah. Like, when did that start? Well, how long have they had bar mitzvahs? Because I thought, oh, this is brilliant. Oh, this is the world coming together in my head. So we see Jesus at 8 days old. That would have been at his circumcision. He's being presented in the temple. So we see his bris, and then we see him at 12 or 13 or whatever at the temple. He's gone to the temple, and now he's being presented as a son of the covenant, a son of the commands. That's what bar mitzvah means, son of the covenant commands of God. And so then we will see him later on at his baptism, the beginning of his ministry. It's like, oh, that's so cool. Well, unfortunately, bar mitzvahs didn't really start taking place until many hundreds of years later. Mitzvah, the covenant or the commands of God, is mentioned in the Old Testament but as far as a specific ceremony to become a son of the commands of God, to commit yourself, in that rite of passage, the coming of age. Now I'm a man at the ripe old age of 13. That doesn't come around until like the 1400s. I don't know if you know exactly what happens in a bar mitzvah. I had not been a part of one until we were in Jerusalem, and apparently that's a big deal. You have your bar mitzvah right there, within sight of the temple. Some of them, and the gates, from outside the city to inside the old part of the city, there were multiple groups of families celebrating. There was trumpets and drums and horns, and I mean they're doing all this dancing and stuff. We kind of got pulled into it. Actually, both my mom and Stacy ended up being a part of the bar mitzvah dancing. They've got their boy up on their shoulders, and they're hiking him around, and they would lead him down to the western wall, and there he would, for the first time, be called upon to read parts of the Torah, the books of Moses, out loud. At a bar mitzvah, there would also be some of his first teaching, like, so now that you're a man, you're 13 years old, what do you think? What can you teach us? What can you tell us? And then also he would offer thanks to the community. He would offer thanks to his parents for bringing him up to be a son of the Lord's covenant. Today, there's also chanting from the prophets. There's leading as a part of a prayer service, and every bar mitzvah pledges to love and to honor and to keep the holy Torah, the law of God. And again, many young Jewish men in Jerusalem will do that in the shadow of the western wall. There were lots of young boys with scrolls out there, going through all that. Jesus may not have had a bar mitzvah, but he definitely was a son of the covenant, a son of the commandments. But he wouldn't have experienced anything like what we call a bar mitzvah today. Okay. So then there's all the rest of this chapter. We really focused on verse 40 and verse 52. They're sort of the bookends, I think, that show us. There's these statements, and then the verses in the middle, 41 to 51, kind of demonstrate how all that was coming about. So let's talk a little bit about that. Verse 41, we see that Jesus' family has made the journey from Nazareth to Jerusalem. So here on the map, which nobody on the screen can see, you've got Nazareth up here in the north, kind of straight across here from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, and then Jerusalem, which is down here straight across from the north end of the Dead Sea. That trip, as the crow flies, is somewhere around 65 miles. If you're going to follow some of the roads that are there, it ends up being maybe as much as 90 or 95 miles. It is not an amount that you could walk in a day. In a car today, it takes about 2 hours to drive from one end to the other. But for Jesus's family, it would have probably been more like 3 or 4, maybe 5 days, depending on bathroom breaks and camping spots, and Are we going to stop and play in the river and all that sort of thing? So it would have been a long trip, not unmanageable, but it's not something you just zip over and do and then go home. The family is going to Jerusalem for what celebration?
Passover.
For the Passover feast. Passover is the annual celebration in March or April for us of God's deliverance of Israel from slavery in Egypt. We go back to the book of Exodus. We see the 10 plagues that Moses warned Pharaoh about. God hardened Pharaoh's heart. There are these 10 plagues that took place to try to convince him to let the people go. And it wasn't until the 10th and final plague that Pharaoh finally relented. The 10th plague was what?
Death of the firstborn.
Death of the firstborn. Every firstborn child, and actually firstborn animals as well, were going to die unless the blood of the lamb was painted on the doorposts and the lintel of all the homes of the Israelites. When the death angel came, if he saw the blood on the doorpost and the lintel, then he would pass over that house, and death wouldn't stop there. Passover is one of the 3 major festivals that required a pilgrimage. So you've got this one, you have Passover, but you also, 7 weeks later, have, it's called various things, the Feast of Weeks, and months. The Feast of Weeks, or what we call it now, is the Feast of Pentecost, because Pentecost means 50 days, and it's 7 weeks after Passover is when this one occurs. So those are both in the spring, and then in the fall there is the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which is kind of like it's sort of like Pioneer Days for us, or a camp out for us. They left their homes, they would go out into the wilderness, they'd build these little shelters like they used to build in the wilderness during the Exodus, so that, things are made out of branches and sticks and rocks, and they would camp out for a few days to celebrate the harvest, to celebrate God's provision. So we have spring ones and one in the fall. You were supposed to go to Jerusalem for those. So it is Passover, and Mary and Joseph and Jesus, along with hundreds of thousands of other people, are making their way to Jerusalem for Passover. A lamb would be sacrificed at the temple. Families would participate in the special meal of Passover, which we've done here a number of times. There's our special dishes, meal dishes that are used. They had to eat standing up, packed and ready to go, as a remembrance of that last meal that they had in Egypt. While they have the meal, they recite the Haggadah or Haggadah. My Hebrew is not good, but the Haggadah is the retelling, the ceremonial retelling of the Exodus, how they came to be slaves in Egypt and how they came to be free. Families still do a lot of those same things today. And it's not a surprise that we see the family doing this, because we've already established that Mary and Joseph are very devout in their execution of their faith. They follow the law, they follow the commands, they follow the customs, and they're raising their son to do all the same things. So it's not surprise that they're making this trip. I'm assuming this is not their first trip to Jerusalem with Jesus, that they have made multiple trips to Jerusalem with him. So they've come from across the plain at Nazareth. They've come into the hill country. They've gone up to Mount Zion, the city of David. They've come to Jerusalem. They've gone through the Passover. They celebrated the Passover probably with family or whoever there. And now it's all done. It's time to go back home. So they make the trek back down the hill over there towards the north. They travel for a day. And the belief is that with the hundreds of thousands of other people that are all making the same trek, that Jesus is back there with some other family or with some other friends. The word that's used really kind of has the idea of caravan. Jesus is back there somewhere, or he's up there somewhere, but we're all headed home. Have you seen him? Nah, but he's back with his cousins. So let's not sweat it. Okay. He's not in our here. We don't have to worry about him. He's fine. And we don't have these details, but in the movie in my head, as night approaches, they've set up their camp. They've been collecting wood for a fire. They're going to have a meal, and they start looking for him. Hey, when you see Jesus, send him our way. And he doesn't come, and nobody has seen him, and nobody has seen him, and they start getting panicky. It's getting dark. They haven't eaten. They can't find their son. Where is this boy? The
model child.
Yeah, the model child is nowhere to be found, and they've been traveling for most of the day. So they could be 8, 10, 12 miles away. It would have been mostly downhill. They can't find him. The verb means that they diligently searched. It wasn't just, I don't know, I haven't seen him, he'll come home. They're desperately seeking him. They're trying to find him. Nobody has seen him. And so, like all parents, where was the last place we saw him? Well, we saw him in Jerusalem. I imagine that as they go back to Jerusalem, that it takes way less time to get back to the city than it's taken them to get down the hill to where that they are. And I know he's the golden child, and he is full of wisdom and grace of God, with grace with God and grace with man. But I'm assuming, as a father, that there are potentially some murderous threats going on in his head. Where is that boy? I swear, when I find him, he's going to be in so much trouble. Why would he do this to us? She's probably crying. He's probably angry. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe everybody's mad, I don't know. But I have to imagine this is a fairly emotional deal. Their special boy is nowhere to be found.
See, what goes on in my mind is they're all worried about him when they can't find him. But when they find him, it's like, I'm glad you're all right. Now I'm going to kill you.
So when they get to Jerusalem, the verb is the same. When they get there, they are searching diligently again, or still. They're frantically looking, knocking on doors, every place that they've been, retracing steps, because that's what you would have to do. But they didn't find him the first day. They didn't find him the second day. Finally, on the third day, they find Jesus. And where do they find him?
In the temple.
At church. Okay. They find Jesus at the temple. He's not blowing his allowance in the marketplace. He is not hanging out with his buddies, doing questionable things. He's not being a bad kid. He's in the temple. He is sitting there listening to the teachers. They're teaching, they're expounding on the law, and he's not just listening, but he's also asking them questions. I don't know what kind of things he's asking, but I do know that with the language that Luke uses, that it is possible that he's not just throwing them softball questions that are really simple, that he's really working them over.
It says they're also amazed at his answers.
Yes.
Doesn't that kind of make it rhetorical questions?
Some of them,
or like
yeah.
a test?
Yeah. The word about questioning, the definition is to accost with inquiry or to interrogate. So the 12-year-old Jesus is putting the screws to him, like, oh yeah, sure, you say that, but what about this? And what about that? Have you considered this? But doesn't it also say, I mean, that's kind of the questions that I hear Jesus asking. He is listening and he is learning. He's gaining some understanding, which seems appropriate for those bookend verses we've talked about already, that are focused on his growth and his maturity. But he is also, because he is wise, because he has a good mind, a good intellect, he's also asking questions that make them wonder as well. The reaction of the people in the temple is amazement, astonishment, which is nice. Those are nice words. That seems like kind of churchy words. But the word can also mean to lose your mind or go crazy. It can mean to go insane. So the people who are standing there listening to this exchange, and maybe some of the teachers themselves, are freaking out that this 12-year-old boy is so much smarter than they are.
Wise beyond his years. Can I throw something else in?
Yep.
He may be learning, but he's learning how they interpret what he may already know instinctively.
They may be doing some of the same things that I do. Like, it just occurred to me. Finally, it's all clicked. And Jesus is going, well, duh. Yeah, that was the point. Why did it take you until you were 53 to figure this out? Okay. His intellect, his mind is impressive to the people who are there, which is shown both in the questions that he asks, but also in the answers that he gives as well. And when Mary and Joseph find him on day number 3, I mean, he's been doing this to these people now for 4 days, because there was the first day of traveling and 3 days back until they found him. This has been going on for almost a week, that he's been working these guys over in the temple. And when they get there, the text says that they too were amazed. The word literally means that they were knocked over or knocked down. They are bowled over by the fact that when they find this boy, he is not doing anything else but sitting in the temple and talking to the teachers of the law.
Like Marine says, astonished.
That seems very sanitized and clean. I like the things that are a little more visceral and a little more descriptive. Like they're knocked over. They were going crazy. They were out of their minds because this kid was so smart. And so, like every good mother, and maybe especially every good Jewish mother, there's the big guilt trip. Jesus, how could you do this to us? Why? Why have you treated us this way? What Mary says, let's get it here. Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Again, kind of the shades of meaning in the language is that they have been racked with sorrow and grief. They're crying, they're grieving, they believe they've lost this boy. They may never see him again. What has happened? They're beside themselves, and they're frantic, going through the city in a panic, trying to figure out where this boy is, and they finally find him. They can kind of stop for a second. Their grief and their sorrow. Why did you do this? How can you treat us this way? We have looked everywhere for you. And here's where my American culture gets in the way. Because I hear Jesus' response like I hear every junior high response. No, why didn't you look here first? Why wouldn't you think to come here first? Why didn't you start in my Father's house? And I think there's probably a duh in between the lines in there someplace. But I don't believe he would have been that disrespectful. There would have been no eye rolling, probably. Had it been my kids, absolutely. But they have raised this boy to be devout. They have taught him the customs of his people. They have taught him the laws of Moses. They have brought him faithfully to Jerusalem for these festivals. He's a son of the covenant. He's a son of the commands of Moses. He's a child of the law. So, Mom, why wouldn't you have started here? If you know what you do about me, why wouldn't you start here before you blew 3 days looking up and down the streets and alleys and shops of Jerusalem?
May I ask a question?
You may ask a question.
It says these were teachers. It didn't say they were Pharisees, they weren't Sadducees, they weren't Levite priests.
Yes, it just says that they're didaskalos. They're just teachers of the law, rabbis.
Oh, rabbis, okay.
Some of them may have been Pharisees, some of them may have been Sadducees. He may have been stirring up a hornet's nest between the two of them, asking questions. Well, there's not much more identification other than they are teachers in the temple.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Yes, Joanne.
As I've always read this, I know, Joan. Is it possible that this was the first time that Jesus' parents realized that Jesus knew that he was the Son of God? I mean, is it possible that his parents just raised him but never told him about his birth and who he actually was? And this was the first time that they realized that he knew who he was?
Okay, so the question is it possible that this is the first time that he has an awareness of who he is, or maybe that they have a recollection of who he is? I suppose it's possible, but I guess it would seem sort of unlikely. And my answer would be totally rooted in my own experience. When my kids have a birthday, very often we will retell the story of their coming into the world. You know, what the pregnancy was like, how nauseous mom was, what she craved, what she didn't crave, you know, what it was like when we went to the hospital, how long she was in labor, what the surgery was like, how long she was in the, and all that kind of stuff to, you know, because that was an important historical event. It would seem to me if there were crazy shepherds and angels and later on, you know, foreign travelers who had come to visit and brought incredible gifts, like, Mom, where did we get this great rug? Well, that's one of the rugs from your birthday. That's when the wise men came. I guess it would seem almost impossible for me that in the previous 11 years that they have not talked with him about the circumstances, at a minimum, the circumstances surrounding his birth. That is wild speculation. But I'm guessing it may be the reason that Luke includes this account is that as a child even, Jesus has some awareness of who his Father is and how important it is to be submissive to his Father. It is interesting that in the next verse, in verse 51, and I think it kind of ties these things together. Then he went down to Nazareth and was obedient to them. Okay? He's been in his Father's house, listening to his Father's word, listening for his Father's will, being concerned with his Father's purposes for the world. And now, at the end of this time of teaching and questions and growing and development, he is going back with his parents and he is being submissive and subject to them. You know, I'm always looking for some parallels, and it would seem like maybe that's an important parallel. Jesus is submissive to his Father in the temple, and now he goes back to Nazareth where he's going to be submissive to his parents on earth. How's that?
Well, it is one of the commandments. So.
It is interesting. I'm just going to go ahead and turn this thing off because it's about to die. Hey, that pretty much wraps it up for a little discussion here on this account. We'll pick up here in another week, moving on with Jesus' ministry and potentially John the Baptist. So join us again next week. Until then, hit that subscribe button. Bye.
Bye.
I'm not leaving you. I'm just leaving them.